I still remember the exact moment when I knew something inside me had shifted forever. It wasn't the first time they laughed at me. No, it had been happening for years. But that day, the sound of their voices, sharp, mocking, echoing off the walls of a room that should have felt like home, hit me differently. I was standing in the kitchen, drying a plate, pretending the trembling in my hands wasn't visible, as my sister leaned back in the living room chair, smirking, telling a story I hadn't even been in. And then Aunty actually said she couldn't lend me the money. Can you believe that? She said, voice light and teasing, but with enough venom hidden beneath the surface to make anyone who knew me flinch. I smiled. Of course I smiled. I was expected to smile. That was my role, wasn't it? The ever-patient auntie, the one who could endure, absorb, forgive, and stay small. But what they didn't see, what no one saw, was the storm growing inside me, slow and silent, until it became a quiet, terrifying kind of power. I walked past her, the plate clinking against the countertop, and I pretended to pour water into the sink with deliberate slowness, savoring each second. Every laugh, every whispered comment about me online, every public jab at my expense had been noted. I kept a ledger in my head, a careful tally of moments when people decided I wasn't worth respect. And I asked myself, quietly, in the safety of my own thoughts, what would you do in my shoes? Would you just let it slide? Would you forgive and forget when they don't even see what they've done? I wanted justice, not vengeance for cruelty's sake, but justice measured in careful, inevitable consequence. It began with small things. The niece stealing my favorite scarf, the cousin borrowing money and pretending to forget to pay it back, my sister pretending she didn't notice when I quietly sacrificed something for the family. At the time, each cut felt tiny, almost trivial, but the truth is, small cuts accumulate, and pain is patient. You don't always feel it all at once, but after years, the wound deepens, and suddenly you realize you've been living inside it without realizing the shape of your own despair. I made a promise to myself one rainy evening after cleaning up the mess from another careless party they had thrown, the kind where they treated me like furniture, useful for appearance, invisible in essence. And I whispered, barely audibly, one day they'll see. One day it will be different, and I will be ready. The first real sting came when the niece posted a video online, a short clip, no longer than a minute, where she laughed directly at my quirky habits, things she'd exaggerated from reality, things I had trusted her with. The caption read something like, "Family quirks never fail to make me laugh. #Aunty Chronicles." I froze when I saw it. The way she smirked, the way the camera captured her eyes glinting with amusement, it was cruel and deliberate. For a moment, I felt rage rise uncontrollably, the kind that makes your hands shake and your stomach knot. I could have called her out, screamed, demanded she take it down, but instead, I turned off my phone and sat in silence. The storm had been growing for years, and I knew the first flash of lightning shouldn't be wasted. Patience, I told myself. Let it simmer. Let it grow until the moment is perfect. Be honest with yourself. Could you have done that? Could you have waited when your heart is pounding with rage? The next betrayal was more subtle, more insidious. My sister, who had always masked manipulation behind polite smiles, began borrowing money for emergencies that were never emergencies, gifts that were never gifts, while claiming I owed her loyalty and support. She had a way of twisting words that made me feel guilty for things I hadn't done, or worse, for existing in a space that wasn't hers to control. And everyone else, the extended family, the neighbors, the friends who liked to gossip, they never questioned her. They nodded, smiled, and moved on, leaving me to clean up the invisible bruises of my own dignity. But I kept notes, tiny, almost invisible notes. A receipt here, a message there, a memory tucked away with meticulous care. Because when the time came, I would need a map of every slight, every injustice, every laugh that had been directed at me. I remember the first time I allowed myself to envision revenge. It wasn't violent. It wasn't loud. I didn't want anyone to see the process forming in my mind. I imagined them in the living room, thinking I was small and harmless, unaware of the slow, careful plan unfolding behind my calm demeanor. I imagined subtle exposures, truths revealed in ways that couldn't be ignored, consequences that couldn't be spun into humor or excuse. And for the first time in a long time, a sense of control spread through me, warm and steady, replacing the hollow ache I had carried for years. I wanted them to understand that actions have weight, that mockery, betrayal, and dishonesty do not simply vanish into the air as if they are inconsequential. And so the planning began. First, I had to build credibility for myself, silently, invisibly. I found work across town that kept me busy and gave me hours to think, to observe, to plan. I learned about people's routines, their habits, the times they were most vulnerable. I mapped out their social circles, their allies, the people they trusted blindly. Every conversation they had, every move they made, became part of a larger picture. I asked myself constantly, if they were trying to harm me, what would they do? How could I anticipate them? And then I recorded, cataloged, and plotted, all under the guise of being the quiet, forgiving Aunty. The irony of it made me smirk sometimes in the solitude of my apartment. They had no idea I was not just observing, I was preparing. The betrayals escalated in many scenes of everyday life. The niece, for instance, began borrowing more than scarves, books, jewelry, personal letters, and documenting them in her videos, flaunting them as if the act itself was playful, a harmless quip for social media. She didn't realize that each stolen item was a breadcrumb, a clue, a thread in the tapestry I was weaving. My sister, the orchestrator, continued to smile in gatherings, presenting the facade of a perfect family while subtly undermining me at every turn. And I endured, carefully, with the precision of a surgeon observing a patient's vitals before operating. Close calls tested my patience. One afternoon, the niece invited me over, smiling through tears, asking me to forgive her and promising to make amends. My instinct wanted to throw everything to the wind, to expose her right then and there. But I remembered the plan, the long game. I had to be the one with patience, the one with the upper hand. So I nodded, accepted a cup of tea, and let her think she had won a small victory. The tiny thrill of deception was mine, not theirs. That's when I realized the power of perception, that revenge isn't about shouting. It's about letting others act first, while you quietly prepare your move.
By the end of that first year of planning, I had assembled a meticulous archive of evidence. Screenshots, receipts, photographs, recorded conversations, messages that revealed the unvarnished truth. I had memorized their routines, predicted their social interactions, and understood the subtle cracks in their confidence. I had become invisible, but with eyes and ears that missed nothing. And in the silence, in the shadows, I made the silent promise again. One day, they will see. One day, It will all be revealed, and I will not miss a single detail. I moved without announcing myself, which had become a specialty I mastered over months. Small, deliberate changes that looked like nothing to anyone else, but felt enormous to me. Section 2 of my life was not a dramatic montage. It was a sequence of tiny, calibrated acts that, when added together, began to feel like a force. The apartment where I worked on the plan smelled faintly of lemon and old paper. The notebook, with its creased spine, lived on my kitchen table like a small, faithful animal, its pages full of dates, names, and short, clipped observations. I would wake early, make tea, and read through the entries as if they were scripture. In private, I practiced the voice I would need to use when the time came. Calm, precise, unhurried. A voice that could deliver truth without melodrama and force people to listen because the facts themselves would do most of the work. I hired the paralegal after weeks of searching for someone discreet and competent. She was young, mid-20s, sharp-eyed with a quiet confidence that reminded me of myself before life had taught me caution. Her name was Layla, and she was everything I needed and nothing they would expect me to find. When she sat across from me in my little living room, flipping through the folder I'd brought her with casual professional interest, I felt the paradoxical relief of someone entrusted with a secret. "You have more than I expected," she said, and that was one of the most satisfying things I heard all month. It wasn't triumph born of cruelty. It was the sober recognition that truth could be arranged and presented. Layla taught me to think in paperwork. What needed signature, what required corroboration, which statements had to be recorded on tape, and which would stand alone because they were self-evident. She also reminded me of nuance. The things that could be misread, the areas where pride might make people defensive. We learned how to build a case that would be immune to gossip and resistant to spin. Meanwhile, I expanded my quiet surveillance into places that mattered. I started attending the small gatherings I would always have skipped, smiling with the practiced gentleness of someone who belongs to the room and taking notes in the margins of my mind. At a tea party hosted by a neighbor, I watched my sister perform the same jokes she always did, the ones that made people laugh at my expense. She moved with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed cruelty to the point of art. I watched her hands as she gestured, the way a smirk flickered at the corner of her mouth when she thought the joke landed. When she passed me the tray of biscuits, she said loud enough for others to hear, "Isn't Aunty just the sweetest for letting us all treat her like family?" The room tittered. I smiled and placed a biscuit in my mouth as if tasting nothing at all. Inside, I cataloged witness list, timing, the offhand nature of the insult. Later that night, I transcribed the interaction into the notebook with neat letters as if writing a small, precise prayer. The niece's social media feed became a strategic battlefield, where once I might have scrolled by with a hurt tightening my throat, now I watched patterns. Who commented, what time she posted, the recurring props she used to dramatize her life. I noted brands, locations, and small mentions that seemed innocent, but were invasive. A throwaway line about borrowing from Auntie's closet, a tagged friend who always laughed in the comments. Layla taught me about preserving screenshots in a way that made them hard to delete. Metadata, timestamps, archived copies sent to secure emails so that nothing could be altered without leaving a trail. It felt almost too clever to be legal art, but all of it was domestic civility applied to defense. I was learning a language of evidence that matched their language of petty cruelty. Close calls became the hidden punctuation of my days. Once the niece almost discovered the envelopes I'd left in a safe deposit box.
A silly detail, perhaps, but it could have revealed that I was preparing something other than therapy and quiet dinners. She came over one afternoon, eyes bright with a new project, asking me to help her look for a lost receipt, because you always keep the best records. My heart lurched. She sounded casual, but I had learned to read that tone. It was the same tone a pickpocket uses, friendly, easy, a suggestion of trust. I kept my face neutral and agreed to help her look, and while she rifled through drawers with the naivete of a camera-trained content creator, I slipped a note into my pocket and left the room. After she left, I redoubled my precautions. Files were scanned and encrypted, documents photocopied and stored in multiple places. The risk had jolted me, but it hadn't derailed me. In fact, it refined my focus. There were moments when my conscience whispered that perhaps I was becoming too meticulous, too intent on exposing people who might simply be thoughtless rather than malicious. Those were the evenings I allowed my memories to run loose, the times I replayed how my sister had laughed at me in the kitchen, the way my cousin had glanced at my blouse as if appraising the worth of my pockets. Memory, I learned, was not neutral. It had the power to justify cruelty and to fuel resolve. I returned to those evenings to remind myself of why I had begun. This was not about humiliation, it was about boundaries. Was that selfish? Perhaps. But when I asked myself what I wanted, the answer was never vengeance alone. It was an insistence that people stop treating me like a movable object in their family narrative. We constructed the plan in layers. The first layer was restoration, get back what was taken or misused. The second was exposure, let truth arrive in a way that could not be spun into a joke. The third was consequence, legal or social corrections that compelled restitution. We did not seek to ruin anyone's life. Instead, we sought to make accountability unavoidable. Layla was brilliant at suggesting small legal maneuvers that felt monumental to people who assumed law was a faraway thing only used by other families. We drafted polite but firm letters requesting repayment, sent certified notices for items pawned, and filed small claims that were procedural but public. Each paper served not only a legal function, but a social one. Once a document exists, it can be read by others, and people hate to be the subject of documents. That small, bureaucratic pressure accumulated faster than any public shaming might have.
The cousin's bravado was a problem because he was charming in a particular way. Loud laughter, a hand on a shoulder, jokes that disarmed observers. He relied on charm like armor. He joked his way out of consequences. I needed to pierce that armor with things that amused people would still accept as facts. So we began with the heirloom. I had learned the pawnbroker's name after a neighbor had seen the cousin enter the shop late one evening. I made a call in person. Nothing dramatic, just a careful question and a conversation about the value of objects and the ethics of pawning family items. The broker, a man with tired eyes but a decent moral code, remembered the cousin and provided a receipt. It was such an ordinary thing on paper, a date, a signature, a stamped logo. To the cousin's supporters, it would look like a mistake. But signatures tend to last longer than excuses. I printed the receipt on a crisp sheet and placed it in an envelope, not because I wanted to accuse him loudly, but because I wanted the option of truth to be tangible. Slowly, methodically, the social tide shifted. I began posting short, factual statements online. Not angry invectives, but little items of truth. A photograph of the gloves with a caption, "Found these in my drawer," I keep everything tidy. Strange that they were missing. A picture of a receipt with the line, "This looks familiar. Perhaps someone would like to explain." These posts were not designed to shame. They were intended to place facts in public space, where they could be witnessed without being twisted. I learned the surprising pleasure of being boringly factual. When people read facts, they are forced to weigh them. When they read gossip, they can laugh and move on. The algorithm, oddly enough, responded to restraint. Authenticity attracted quiet, thoughtful responses, rather than loud, mocking ones. People began to ask questions. Are you okay? Do you need help? Those small messages mattered more than I expected. They suggested that truth had an audience, and that my voice was being heard. But revenge plans are never tidy. Real people exist, and they bring emotion and unpredictability. The cousin, when cornered in a subtle way by a family member who confronted him privately, did what cornered men do. He lashed out. He called me, his tone forced into a humor that did not reach his eyes, and said, "Why are you making accusations? Is this how you repay a family?" He tried to appeal to common sense and blood, hoping to muddy a clear issue with sentiment. I listened, my tea cooling in my hands, and then, slowly, I recited the facts. No theatrics, no raised voice, just dates, times, and the receipt. His laughter went brittle at the edges. "You're making a problem out of nothing," he said, and I replied with a soft question instead of a threat. "Would you be willing to return what was pawned?" The pause on the line told me more than a confession. If I could keep my voice steady, their denial often crumbled into action because people prefer repair to public consequence when they think an issue is small. He did not return the item that day, but the conversation planted a seed of fear that felt deliciously justified. Meanwhile, I cultivated allies in quiet ways. There was an aunt, not the gossipy kind, but the sensible one who smiled with her eyes, who had watched me with a distant sympathy for years. She was the kind of person who remembered small cruelties and tucked them away as if saving them for a rainy day. I invited her for tea and, without dramatics, told her a few things she likely had suspected but not known in detail. Her reaction was not immediate outrage, but a slow, accumulating understanding. She became my confidant in the family, not to fan fires, but to create a space where truth could be heard without being dismissed. That mattered more than any public denouncement. People who knew the quiet realities of the family could now act as witnesses when the time came to confront the narratives that had been spun. Layla and I also built the social media element into our plan carefully. Instead of counterattacking with the same crude tools the niece used, we created a pattern of dignified presence online, a consistent posting schedule of small, true things that painted a picture of someone who had been treated unjustly without ever pleading. We invited conversation by asking questions. Has anyone experienced someone borrowing and not returning? Banal, yes, but it opened a space where others could share similar stories. The comments became a chorus of empathy. That chorus, small and steady, would bolster any public revelation we later staged, because people are more likely to listen when others have already spoken up. This was not a mob. It was a slow building of credibility. Obstacles kept emerging like thorns in a neat hedge. Once, a distant cousin who had been friendly with the niece decided to smear me preemptively on a private group chat, a small, bitter message accusing me of being petty. I discovered the chat because I had made a friend of someone who had access to it. We did not ambush the cousin publicly, but Layla wrote a calm note addressing the issues in the thread, offering to clarify any misunderstandings, and provided specific examples. The cousin deleted the chat moments later and apologized privately. It was a small victory for diplomacy.
It taught me that sometimes exposure need not be explosive. A softer approach often unspooled the same consequence with less collateral damage. There were nights when the weight of it all pressed on me, when I lay awake thinking about how close I was to turning into the kind of person I despised, the one who monitors, plots, and smiles at the wrong moment. In those hours, I reminded myself of the line I would not cross. No violence, no public shaming that humiliated for amusement, nothing that would take away someone's ability to survive. I wanted accountability, not annihilation. That boundary kept me human. It also made the plan more effective. People are more likely to change when confronted with evidence than when they are destroyed. As the months progressed, the evidence we had compiled began to feel less like a list and more like the anatomy of a story, each piece a paragraph in a book that would someday sit on a table and be read. The heirloom, the borrowed money receipts, the niece's videos tagged with casual thefts, the messages showing my sister's manipulations, all of it created a pattern that could not be explained away by one careless comment or a bad day. It was a pattern born of consistent choices. That consistency was our ally, and I cherished it. We rehearsed the disclosures in private, how I would speak at the family gathering, which documents I would present first to create the maximum effect without cruelty, how to let silence do the work when people fumbled for explanations. The paralegal insisted on timing and documentation. I insisted on dignity.
And then came the last close call before the crescendo. The niece, perhaps sensing the shift, posted a video that was a thinly veiled apology. Staged, practiced, full of contrition meant for likes rather than repair. She asked followers to forgive me, I was young, and I read the comments with a kind of clinical interest. Many wrote, we forgive you. Some wrote, you're so brave, and a few asked questions. The video was a threat in its own way because it suggested reconciliation without restitution. So I did something only mildly theatrical. I posted a quiet photo of the same niece's first video alongside the apology, with the caption, "Growth looks like accountability. Can we talk about what that means?" It was gentle, but it reframed the conversation from forgiveness into responsibility. The responses were immediate and measured. People who had watched from the sidelines started to ask more direct questions. Did she ask Aunty for the dress back? Did she offer to return things? The niece's followers, suddenly curious, began to look for answers. That curiosity would be a pressure valve we could use later. By the time I announced the family tea, innocuous, ordinary, the kind of thing that would not raise suspicion, the plan felt less like a secret and more like an inevitability. Invitations went out under the cover of casual updates. I made sure the room would be warm and familiar because I did not want the gathering to feel like an ambush. I wanted the truth to land in a space where it could be digested, not weaponized. There is a kind of cruelty in theatrical humiliation, and I wanted none of it. My goal was clarity, consequence, and the ability for people to choose how to respond. What would you have done in my place? Would you have gathered them like this or sought a simpler path? I can tell you what I felt. If I had not called them together, the ledger in my head would have continued to be written on forever, and I would have been the only one to carry that burden. So, I practiced my calm voice until it felt like an old coat. I practiced not raising my hand when someone tried to interrupt. I practiced breathing into silence. And then I waited for the day, letting ordinary life proceed in its small motions, while the architecture of consequence sailed around me like scaffolding. The stage was set, and the audience, my family, had no idea they were part of an experiment in truth. The morning of the gathering arrived like any other, but in my chest there was a quiet tremor of anticipation, the kind that comes when you know a long-held plan is about to meet reality. I dressed carefully in the ruby red dress I had reserved for moments of quiet empowerment, the one that made my posture feel straighter and my gaze sharper. Jewelry was subtle, gold and ruby accents catching the light just enough to suggest dignity without drawing undue attention. Even the watch on my wrist was deliberate, sleek, understated, a symbol that time was finally on my side. Every choice was intentional because I had learned over months that details mattered. They carried the story as much as words would. As I arranged the living room, placing cups and plates with careful symmetry, I ran through the order of disclosures in my mind. The first revelation would be undeniable, simple. The heirloom returned with the pawnbroker's receipt. Next would follow the letters and documentation of borrowed money, presented not as accusations, but as a narrative of patterns they could not deny. The niece's videos would come last, paired with the chronological evidence of items taken and promises broken. And throughout, my tone would remain calm, steady, controlled. I wanted them to see the logic, not the theatrics. Guests began to arrive, and the ordinary hum of chatter filled the room. My sister, smiling too widely, glanced at me once and then looked away, probably thinking she had nothing to worry about. The cousin laughed loudly at a small joke made by another relative, unaware of the receipt waiting silently on the envelope on the coffee table. The niece twirled around with her phone in hand, already imagining the story she would post about the tea being a sweet family reunion. None of them suspected that the ordinary atmosphere was a veneer. I poured tea with deliberate calm, my hands steady, my expression neutral, letting the normalcy cloak the gravity of what was to come. I began softly, almost conversationally. I wanted us all to gather today to share some updates about family items and responsibilities that have been scattered over time. My voice carried in the warm room, gentle but precise. Eyes turned toward me, curious, polite, unsuspecting. I held up the envelope with the heirloom receipt. This was pawned last year without permission. I have the proof here. I thought it best to return it now so everyone can see the facts clearly. Silence fell like a thick blanket. My sister's lips pressed into a thin line. The cousin's laugh faltered mid-choke. The niece blinked rapidly, phone forgotten in her hand. I continued, carefully pacing the narrative, each piece building on the last. I displayed receipts for borrowed money, correspondence showing broken promises, and notes I had kept for months detailing patterns of neglect and dishonesty. With each item I presented, I paused, letting the information settle into the room, letting them process the implications, without me needing to comment further. The effect was cumulative, subtle but undeniable. There were small gasps, whispered ohs from relatives, and the quiet shifting of weight as my family realized that their narratives about me, the one in which I was supposedly small and powerless, were unraveling. The niece finally spoke, her voice unsteady. I didn't think it was a big deal. I was just having fun. I tilted my head slightly, letting the words hang in the air. Fun can still cause harm, I said calmly. Do you see that now? She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and for the first time I saw genuine understanding flicker across her face. That moment, small as it seemed, was worth years of careful planning. My sister attempted to interject, offering a defensive smile and a soft laugh. She said, "We didn't mean to hurt you." I held up the letters and receipts with quiet precision.
Intent matters less than impact. Here are the facts. You can see them, or you can continue to dismiss what has occurred. My tone was even, but the gravity in my eyes did the work that words alone could not. For the first time in years, I saw her hesitate, as if the carefully constructed facade she had maintained was cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence.
The cousin tried humor next, a nervous chuckle intended to lighten the moment. Well, I guess we all make mistakes, right? He looked around the room seeking allies, but found none. The aunt who had quietly supported me nodded slightly at me, signaling that the story I had told was being recognized for what it truly was, an accounting of repeated choices with consequences. I turned my attention back to him, calm, unhurried. Mistakes are one thing, I said, but repeated choices that cause harm are another. You can acknowledge this, or you can continue to live with the consequences. The words were soft, but firm. The air in the room shifted palpably, charged with tension and understanding at once. As I moved through the evidence, I occasionally posed questions, inviting reflection rather than confrontation. "How would you feel if you were in my position?" I asked the niece quietly, letting her answer herself. "Would you want to be forgiven without understanding the impact of your actions?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, finally comprehending the full weight of what she had done. I asked my cousin, "If you were here seeing these documents, would you act differently now?" The silence spoke louder than any argument could. The realization had arrived. For years, they had treated me as a character in their story. Today, they were finally seeing me as the author of my own life. By the end of the tea, each person had been confronted with their own choices in a way that could not be dismissed. My voice never rose, my tone never wavered. Yet the impact was profound. Tears, tentative apologies, and quiet acknowledgments filled the room. The niece offered a heartfelt, "I'm sorry." The cousin muttered a strained admission, and my sister, for the first time in decades, was speechless. Her carefully maintained armor of charm and control was broken by truth. I sat back finally, the ruby-red dress feeling heavier than before, not from fabric, but from the weight of years of silent endurance finally released. I had not shouted, I had not humiliated. I had revealed, methodically, clearly, decisively. And as I looked around the room, I realized that the satisfaction was not in vengeance, but in restoration. I had reclaimed my dignity, and for the first time in years, I felt the lightness of being seen, fully and unflinchingly, for who I truly was. The quiet reflection after the event was as important as the gathering itself. I allowed myself to recognize the strength it had taken to wait, to plan, and to execute without cruelty. I also allowed myself to feel gratitude for the paralegal who had guided the legal aspects, for the aunt who had supported me silently, and even for the moments of betrayal that had honed my resolve. They had shaped me, yes, but they had not broken me. And I asked myself, softly, as I sipped the last of my tea, what would you have done in my place? Could you have waited this long? Could you have executed the plan with this precision? I realized then that revenge, properly understood, is not about rage or spectacle. It is about the reclamation of self, the restoration of dignity, and the careful insistence on truth. And in that ruby-red dress, sitting among people who had once laughed at me, I understood that my patience, my planning, and my clarity had achieved what years of endurance alone could not. They had finally seen me, and in that moment, I felt a profound, quiet victory that no mockery, no deceit, and no betrayal could ever touch again. The evening air carried a crisp chill, and I remember walking into the house feeling a strange combination of anticipation and calm. The living room, familiar, yet transformed in my mind, seemed ready to hold the weight of truth. Every chair, every vase, every soft shadow in the corners had been observed countless times, cataloged for its strategic potential. Tonight, the ordinary would become extraordinary, and I was acutely aware of it. I had rehearsed the pacing of my words, the pauses between each revelation, the subtle ways I could let silence amplify their own guilt. As the first family members arrived, they greeted me with warmth and casual conversation, unaware of the tide that had been silently building beneath my composed exterior. My sister's smile was tight, her eyes flicking toward me now and then, testing for signs of vulnerability. The cousin laughed easily, but I noticed the tension beneath it, the slight twitch in his hand, the nervous glance toward his allies. The niece, too, seemed preoccupied, her social media phone tucked away, her earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. I poured tea with a careful hand, letting my presence fill the room without forcing attention, allowing the natural curiosity of those gathered to draw focus toward me. I began slowly, almost conversationally, letting the ordinary tone of a family tea gathering mask the weight of what was coming. I wanted us all to gather tonight because there are things that have been overlooked, patterns that have been ignored, and truths that deserve acknowledgement. A few heads tilted in curiosity, others stiffened with mild apprehension. I paused, letting the words sink. I've kept careful records over time. Nothing here is opinion. It is documented fact. The heirloom was first, as planned. I laid it on the coffee table, placing the pawnbroker's receipt beside it. This item was taken without permission and sold, I said calmly. Here is the proof. The room went quiet. My sister's hand fluttered against her chest. The cousin's smile faltered. The niece's lips parted in a small gasp. The niece began, but I let silence do the work, letting her stumble over the realization that this wasn't a casual accusation, but undeniable evidence. Next came the letters and receipts. I presented them one by one, narrating the chronology of borrowed money, unreturned items, and subtle manipulations that had been ignored for years. I didn't shout. I didn't scold. I didn't dramatize. I simply let the facts speak, watching as their expressions shifted from disbelief to recognition. These are not mistakes, I said gently, but patterns, and patterns have consequences. The cousin's face turned pale, my sister's jaw tightened, the niece's hands trembled slightly as she covered her face. "What would you have done in my shoes?" I asked softly, letting the question linger in the room. It was not rhetorical. Their silence answered it for me. They had never imagined enduring years of subtle cruelty, humiliation, and disregard without retaliation. And now, after all this time, the reckoning had arrived. The niece finally spoke, her voice small and sincere. I didn't think it mattered," she admitted. "I just thought it was a joke." I nodded, letting her words settle. "Impact matters more than intent. Do you see that now?" She nodded again, tears welling in her eyes. That moment of comprehension, fragile and raw, was the first ripple of true accountability. My sister attempted to interject, offering a defensive laugh. "We never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice brittle. I lifted the letters slightly, letting the documents do the speaking. "Intent is irrelevant when harm is done repeatedly," I said softly. "You can acknowledge the facts, or you can continue to deny them. The choice is yours." She opened her mouth to reply, but paused, realizing that the calm precision of truth was far more disarming than any argument or excuse she could offer.
The cousin tried humor next, a nervous chuckle intended to deflect, but it fell flat. "Well, maybe it's all just a misunderstanding," he said, glancing around for support. But there was none. The relatives who had quietly witnessed the events now regarded him with measured scrutiny. Patterns cannot be dismissed as misunderstandings, I said firmly, especially when corroborated by multiple instances. He looked down, defeated. The charm that had once shielded him shattered by the clarity of evidence. The niece, sobbing softly, now handed back a borrowed item. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't realize how much it hurt." I reached out and took the item gently, nodding. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward change," I said softly. "Do you understand why this matters?" She nodded again, and I could see that for the first time she truly did. My sister sat back, speechless, the usual mask of control slipping. The letters, receipts, and documented conversations had stripped away the illusions she had maintained for decades. I did not gloat. I did not mock. I simply waited, letting the weight of truth press upon the room like a quiet, unrelenting tide. The calmness in my demeanor, the methodical presentation of facts, created a tension far more profound than any shouting or spectacle could have produced. As I moved through the final pieces of evidence, social media posts, recorded conversations, and messages that revealed subtle betrayals, the room shifted from disbelief to a profound reckoning. Comments from previously silent relatives emerged, small murmurs of agreement and acknowledgement, validating the pattern of wrongdoing I had laid bare. The niece, the cousin, and my sister all sat in stunned silence, processing the reality of their actions. By the time I concluded, the room was charged with an almost tangible gravity. "This is not revenge for revenge's sake," I said softly. "It is accountability. It is acknowledgement. And it is the reclamation of dignity." The ruby red dress felt heavier now, not from fabric, but from the presence of long-suppressed truth finally given form. Tears, quiet apologies, and hesitant admissions filled the room. The niece's earlier smirk was gone, replaced by the fragile understanding of someone confronted with consequences. The cousin's charm had crumbled into quiet shame. My sister, for the first time, was speechless, caught in the web of undeniable truth she could no longer twist into humor or excuse. I sat back, finally, letting the air of calm authority settle over the gathering. The victory was not in humiliation or spectacle. It was in the restoration of order, the affirmation of dignity, and the undeniable demonstration that truth, carefully and patiently wielded, carries a power no mockery or deceit can resist. I asked them once more, softly, almost rhetorically, "What would you have done in my shoes? Could you have waited this long? Could you have executed such patience and precision?" The room remained silent, the weight of reflection pressing on each of them. And in that silence, I felt the profound satisfaction of having reclaimed not just justice, but the quiet, steady strength that had been my companion all along. The evening ended with no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no public spectacle, just a quiet acknowledgement that things had shifted irrevocably. People left the room with heavy thoughts, and in some cases, tears. I remained, sipping the last of my tea, reflecting on the power of patience, planning, and dignity. The storm I had carried for years had arrived not as chaos, but as clarity. And in that clarity, I found not vengeance, but a profound, lasting sense of triumph. After the last of the family had left, the house felt unusually quiet. The air was thick with lingering emotions, the echoes of whispered confessions, and the unspoken realizations that had settled into every corner. I sat alone in the living room, ruby red dress now soft against my skin, the faint glimmer of gold and ruby jewelry catching the lamplight. For years, I had carried a heavy weight,
the accumulation of disrespect, ridicule, and betrayal. And tonight, that weight had finally shifted. I could feel it in my shoulders, in the slow, deliberate expansion of my chest, in the calm rhythm of my own breathing. The sense of quiet triumph was subtle, not explosive. There was no cheering or celebration, no vindictive glee. Instead, there was clarity. The clarity of knowing that for years I had endured silently, planned meticulously, and acted with precision, all in service of restoring what had been denied to me. Dignity. The satisfaction was not in making them squirm, but in witnessing the inevitability of accountability. I had orchestrated a truth so undeniable that even pride, charm, or humor could not deflect it. And in that inevitability, I found peace. I allowed myself to reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The small betrayals, the forgotten loans, the stolen items, the public jabs, the online videos. Each had left a scar, but each had also shaped me, honed my patience, and refined my sense of justice. I thought of the late nights planning, the careful documentation, the painstaking attention to detail, the hours spent rehearsing my words, crafting my calm tone, arranging evidence in a sequence that would land with precision. Each step had required discipline, emotional control, and faith in the eventual outcome. Could you have endured this? I wondered, if it had been your life? Could you have remained patient, silent, and deliberate when so much of your dignity had been trampled for years? The victories were not loud, but they were absolute. The heirloom had been restored. Borrowed items had been returned. Apologies, genuine and reluctant, had been offered. Patterns of deceit and manipulation had been confronted in a way that left no room for denial. I had not needed to shout, to embarrass, or to humiliate. The truth, presented with patience and precision, had done all the work. I had learned that power is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, methodical, and undeniable. And yet, there was an unexpected ripple of emotion that surprised me. Forgiveness, not of the betrayals themselves, but of the people who committed them. I forgave them not because their actions were excusable, but because I understood that holding onto anger forever would have made me small, just as I had been treated. Forgiveness was not weakness. It was the final act of reclaiming myself. By letting go of resentment, I preserved the dignity I had fought so hard to restore. Could you forgive in my shoes? I asked myself. Could you release the years of hurt without sacrificing the lessons learned or the justice earned?
I reflected on the subtle beauty of patience and planning, on the incredible power of deliberate action. So often, people confuse revenge with chaos, believing that retaliation must be explosive to be effective. But what I had learned is that true power lies in foresight, strategy, and self-control. Each small decision, each careful observation, each measured interaction had been a thread in a tapestry that ultimately told the story of my resilience, intelligence, and strength. The house was quiet now, the hum of life outside fading. I poured myself a small cup of tea and held it, savoring the warmth and the sense of completion. My thoughts wandered to the niece, the cousin, my sister, people who had underestimated me for years. I did not gloat. I did not relish their discomfort. Instead, I acknowledged their humanity, their flaws, and their capacity to learn. Tonight had not been about punishment. It had been about truth, restoration, and the reclamation of a life that had been overshadowed for too long.
I glanced around the living room, now filled with evidence of both endurance and victory. The quiet trophies of careful planning. The documents, receipts, and notes were not merely items. They were symbols of persistence, intelligence, and the power of dignity. I realized that the story I had lived, the meticulous journey of patience, observation, and subtle execution, was a story not only about revenge, but about self-respect. I had proven, first to myself, and then to those who doubted me, that long-term, intelligent action always surpasses impulsive rage. And in that quiet moment, I understood a profound truth. Revenge is not about cruelty. It is about restoring balance. It is about being seen, being heard, and reclaiming the space you are entitled to occupy. It is about patience, strategy, and the unwavering belief that truth, when wielded with precision, is unstoppable. Could you have waited this long? I thought, reflecting on the years of preparation. Could you have maintained your composure when everything inside you screamed for immediate retaliation? I smiled softly, knowing that I had. And in that smile was the quiet, enduring triumph of a life reclaimed. The tea cooled in my hands, and I finally set the cup down. The house, once a place of subtle betrayal, now felt like a sanctuary. The storm had passed, leaving behind clarity, restoration, and a sense of peace that I had not known in years. My gaze lingered on the empty chairs, the silent family photographs, and the faint echo of laughter that had once mocked me. That laughter no longer held power. I had learned, endured, and acted. I had waited, planned, and executed. I had reclaimed myself.